borders. I mean, it's one of the biggest things, and I guess, Kristina, Keneally, the last thing that would show us we might be finally out of the pandemic. Quickly before I get to that, I've spoken to Bob Carr this morning. You know about the tweet on the text. He says he sources a journalist and also claims to know that Dutton has the numbers in the Liberal Party room. Should we take any of that seriously?
Well, Laura, there clearly is a big cloud over this government. They are at each other's throats, offering free character assessments of the Prime Minister. Gladys Berejiklian thinking he's a horrible person. Barnaby Joyce thinking he's a hypocrite and a liar. And some unnamed cabinet minister who thinks he's a complete psycho and a fraud. And while the government is at each other, absorbed with each other, insulting one another, we've got an absolute crisis in aged care. We've got prices going up. We've got problems with rapid antigen tests. While the government's obsessed with itself, they're not focusing on what Australians want and need. It is time to throw this whole rotten, dysfunctional government out because we need a government that's on the side of the Australian people.
Well, one final question on this, because this tweet from Bob Carr benefits perhaps one person, that is Anthony Albanese, in all of this. But, I mean, if Gladys Berejiklian tweeted that she knew that you had the numbers to roll Anthony Albanese, is that something we would take seriously?
Well, I wouldn't be taking too much seriously in that regard.
No, well, it's the same with Bob Carr, right? How would he know? He says his source is a journalist.
Well, I haven't spoken to Bob Carr, but I think the division that currently exists in Australian politics is squarely within the Morrison-Joyce government, an absolute omni-shambles. You don't need to read tweets from former New South Wales premiers to see that. I think everyone in the country can see that while we have this absolute crisis in aged care, we have a government where the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister don't even trust one another. And how can Australians trust them to fix up the crisis in aged care or indeed chart a way out of this pandemic?
All right, let's talk borders now, because a lot of businesses, particularly in the top end, rely on international tourists. When should the border reopen?
Well, Laura, it would be fantastic if the border reopened because we would be able to provide that much needed support to tourism, to aviation and to hospitality sectors. But what we saw yesterday, quite frankly, was another announcement with no delivery, no detail, no plan. I know that there are major stakeholders that didn't know anything about it, hadn't been consulted. And really, let's call a spade a shovel. This splash in the papers yesterday was nothing more than to give Karen Andrews something to talk about when she went on another television program, filling in after Barnaby Joyce pulled out.
It's still important, though,
So
and you're the Shadow Minister.
Was.
You can see the situation, New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, the WA border is still shut. When do you think we should open to tourists, and what should it depend on?
Well, here are some of the questions that the Morrison, splashy announcement yesterday failed to answer and need to be answered so that we can have a safe reopening of our borders. And the first is this, Laura, and I'll quickly go through three. The first is this. One, are people going to have to demonstrate their vaccination status when they get their visa, or are they going to demonstrate it when they show up at the airport? Are we going to have multiple Novak Djokovic situations happening over and over and over again? And how many people are going to be turned away at the border then, if that is the case? So that's the first one. Second one. Australian Border Force officials, it takes them about 30 to 40 seconds in order to process a visa when someone arrives at the border to go through their paperwork. If we're going to add another 30 to 40 seconds while they look at the vaccination status of the passenger, the queues at the airports are just going to balloon out. They're going to balloon out. It's going to cause chaos at our borders. And then lastly, airports are still in the dark. They don't know what the arrangements are going to be, what they're going to be required to do, what kind of lanes they're going to be required to have, what kind of physical spacing they're going to be required to have. If somebody's not vaccinated, where are they going to be taken to? Where are they going to be quarantined? These are all really basic questions with the borders being shut for 2 years, and yet the government has not.
But you still haven't answered my question. When do you think the border should reopen?
Well, Laura, when we have some basic protections in place to ensure that Australians are safe and that our borders are secure.
But what are you talking about when it's basic protections? Because we look
Laura,
at 7,000 cases a day in New South Wales, same in Victoria. But if you're talking about a safety aspect, I mean, would you be okay with the border reopening, and should the public expect a spike in cases again?
Laura, I literally, just with the greatest of respect, took you through 3 specific things the government needs to do before it reopens the border. And if you want, let me add a 4th. They've talked about having a digital passenger card. They're supposed to be introducing it soon. They promised a wholesale change in the visa processing system. Now it seems like we're going to get nothing more than a fancy form someone created on Google Docs. Yeah. I mean, this is a government that has taken its eye off the ball, that doesn't have a plan for reopening of the borders, and they simply are just too focused on themselves, too focused on insulting one another, too focused on the internal power plays, and not focused on the Australian people, and particularly those important hospitality, aviation and tourism sectors.
We've seen through the Djokovic saga that there are dozens of refugees at the Park Hotel in Melbourne. They are deemed not to be a security risk. Would you allow them to remain there if you win government?
Well, I have long said that if people who are in administrative immigration detention are able to live in the community, and if there are no community safety or national security concerns, they should be living in the community. And it's better for them, and it is better for the taxpayer. And indeed, I agree with Peter Dutton when he said it is more cost effective for the taxpayer.
So Mehdi Ali, you know his case by now. Mehdi Ali.
Yes, I do.
Would you release him immediately?
Well, indeed, what we saw yesterday is the Home Affairs Minister make clear there are no security concerns about Mehdi Ali.
So what would you do, though?
It does raise the significant question.
So if there's no security concerns?
Labor has long been of the view that if there are no security concerns, that people who are in administrative detention should be living in community. They're still in a form of detention. They're in a form of community detention, but they should be able to live in the community if there are no national security or character concerns.
Well, what about the Murugappan family? Would you let them go home to Billawheeler?
I've said this many a time now, Laura, of course.
Yeah, so straight away, you win the election, they're allowed home. No longer would they be separated.
Laura, we have spent, Laura, the Australian taxpayer has spent more than $40 million on the government's attempt to try and deport this family that the community in Billawheeler wants home. And let's understand this, their father, Nadez, not only is he a lovely guy and a hard worker, he has a forklift license. You know, the Prime Minister's brain fart last week that he was going to let children drive forklifts. Here's a forklift driver. Why don't we let him go home to the community that wants him in regional Queensland? Okay. Let him get back to work.
All right, I'm glad we cleared that up, because if the Djokovic saga showed us anything, we know how much power the minister has, and you would be that person should Labor win the election. Thanks so much for your time. We'll speak soon.